It is striking that in a knowledge economy, we know so little about the coronavirus that has wreaked death and economic destruction in so short a time. Pundits are debating the possible paths and estimated time of material recovery, while the virulent destruction is still rampant. At present, worldwide infection has crossed 2 million, while the death rate is a frighteningly high 21% of closed cases. Our senses have been assaulted on screen and in print by images of bodies being carted out of hospitals and unceremonious mass burials. Self-righteous religious opportunists have exploited the tragedy to advance their prophetic theories at the expense of hapless victims. They have only succeeded in portraying a malevolent deity intent on and vengeful in inflicting a debilitating pandemic on sinful earthlings. But there are also those who are more sensitive, who struggle to make sense of this catastrophe. N.T. Wright, the prodigious scholar writing in Time magazine, noted that instead of the pandemic being a punishment or a warning, it is perhaps a lament. Lament is what happens when people ask why and don't get an answer. Professor Wright adds, God also laments. The Spirit groans. Jesus weeps. God grieves for His world. As the Spirit laments within us, so we become small shrines where the presence and healing love of God can dwell. But many turn cynical in a catastrophe like the late William Safire, the New York Times columnist, who asked, why does a good and all-powerful deity permit such evil and grief to fall on so many thousands of innocents? People of faith are embarrassed by their God, who is either all-powerful but malevolent, or all-loving but impotent in the face of evil. All the current visuals and commentaries certainly justify the echoes of Shakespeare's Gloucester, who said, as flies to wanton boys are we to the gods, they kill us for sport. In searching for cognitive equilibrium, I have found assurance in the prayer of Moses in Psalm 90. The screaming headline in the prayer is the acknowledgement of our creatureliness. The transience of humanity is set against the backdrop of God's eternality. He was there even before the mountains were formed, and 1,000 years is but a blinking flash to Him. In contrast, we are no more than a wispy dream or a blade of grass strutting in but a moment's glory and swept away before the day is done. We are made conscious of our vulnerability, our inability to control the outcome or contours of our lives. We are humbled into admitting we are not masters or mistresses of our own destiny. We have basked in the successes of our ingenuity for too long, to the point we delude ourselves into thinking we can take the place of God. We have succeeded in prolonging, preserving, and producing life that we mistake ourselves to be God. Only when we are overwhelmed to the point of despair will we wake to the reality that we are not the uncaused first cause or the eternal prime mover. We are, after all, vulnerable creatures formed out of dust. Certainly, the current pandemic starkly reminds us of our mortality and vulnerability. In the final reckoning, we are but dust, from which we are made and to which we will return. One invisible, microscopic but lethal virus can fell the most magnificent, well-accomplished, and the finest specimen of the human race. Ultimately, we are not the creator. We are but creatures. Secondly, we need to be reminded we are not aimless creatures. We may be dust, but we have the breath of God in us. Our lives, therefore, are contingent on the mercy of God. As the prayer of Moses indicates, only when God shows compassion will humans be satisfied, glad, joyful, and established. The real miracle in life is that anything goes right at all. If we wake healthy every morning, that is a miracle of mercy in a world so distorted by sin. If our children turn out well, or we are still employed, or our spouses remain faithful to us, each is a blessing of mercy from the hand of God. Because sin is woven into the fabric of human life, nothing should be expected to go right. That so much still goes right signals that God has not abandoned us to the outworking of our own depravity. Finally, Moses prays, "Teach us to live wisely and well." The older versions render, "Teach us to number our days." Conjure up the image of a doctor telling a patient how many more days are left before the illness terminates him or her. However, the import of that prayer is that we would use wisely all the time we have. That means living in full consciousness that there is no instant replay in life. We cannot turn back the clock, as the pop singer pleads. Each moment in our transient existence has the significance of eternity. That is what God, to whom 1,000 years are like a day, can imbue into time, which in turn makes the work of our hands significant. When Moses concludes his prayer, pleading for God's favor, he asks for the work of our hands to be established. The effect of God's favorable response to that prayer would mean that our work and life become meaningful and purposeful, which is the basis for contentment and fulfillment. It is noteworthy too that living wisely entails living well. The parenthetical boundaries of our earthly sojourn can be packed full with celebratory moments. Living well is to live in the face of God's grace and to feast in His presence. The psalmist attests there are pleasures forevermore at God's right hand. That means God is ever ready to dispense ecstatically pleasurable experiences for His children's enjoyment. This is justification for a weighty Cabernet Sauvignon or an invigorating Pinot Gris accompanying a rack of lamb or a succulent miso cod. We are advertisements for a loving and compassionate God who gives good gifts. If the light of the world has come to us and the darkness cannot overcome it, you and I need to outshine the grim and dreary reality of sin's impact with the grace and mercy of an ever-loving and almighty Creator. There is absolutely no embarrassment in pointing out that God's grace is sufficient for the depths and heights of human experience.